Welcome to our eclectic panel of the afternoon, titled, appropriately, Kaplan and Other Important Jewish Approaches, really Jewish Approaches and Thinkers. And to kick us off, back from Cherem already, just a little silly joke we made this morning about Spinoza. It's a pleasure to welcome Rabbi Dr. Allan Nadler to talk about Kaplan and Spinoza.
Thank you very much. I know our time is very limited and we're not supposed to be thanking people or introducing people, but I feel an obligation to very quickly thank, it's like the Oscars last night, you know, we have how many seconds do we have to thank people? I do want to single out for gratitude my colleague Eric Kaplan, who initially suggested that I participate in the conference and suggested, came forward with the idea of me giving a talk on Kaplan and Spinoza. And my initial reaction was, Kaplan and Spinoza? Let me check my files. There's nothing there. Since then I've learned many things, but thank you, Eric, for inviting me. And I also want to thank, obviously, the organizers, but also I just want to say that yesterday's opening panel, I've been going to academic conferences since I was in graduate school in the early 1970s, and the AJS conferences at the old Copley Plaza Hotel, and I'm very rarely moved, almost to tears, by speakers at academic conferences. So I just want to say, without embarrassing anybody, that the opening panel yesterday, and in particular the remarkably honest and emotionally naked, as it were, in the best sense of the word, presentation by Rabbi Elliot Ratzman, whom I don't know, I found to be tremendously inspirational and very, very moving. So thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you for adding to my shelf life.
You have the check, right? It was just a very beautiful, and it's so nice to hear a rabbi being so honest. Okay. That was the tikkun for being so nice earlier. Okay. Now, let me just begin as follows. Given the circumstances of the day, which we can't but comment upon, let me begin with one area regarding which there is no doubt in my mind that Kaplan and Spinoza would be in full agreement. Today's snowstorm has no meaning. It has no purpose. There is no goal, no plan. God doesn't have us where we have to be. There's no message in the whiteness outside. It just is. Natura naturans. On that, they would agree. The inclement weather, combined with a quote that I just caught as I finally managed to make it here towards the end of the previous panel, which was Kaplan on Sukkot. Here is where we can find a divergence between Kaplan and Spinoza. Sukkot, Kaplan writes, if I remember the quote that was posted correctly, is a protest against civilization's tendency to destroy human happiness. I don't think one could ever fit that notion of a ritual observance into Spinoza's deterministic, coldly deterministic philosophy. But since that quote was up there, of Sukkot as a protest against civilizations, I will change it a little, nature's tendency to destroy happiness. I'm reminded of an encounter with the late Levi Becker, who I'm sure many of you remember. He was a founding rabbi of Congregation Beth El in Montreal, where I am currently serving as interim rabbi. And he was also the founding rabbi of the Congregation Dorshei Emet, the Reconstructionist Synagogue in Montreal. This took place in 1974 on Erev Sukkot, and it was a very, very rainy Sukkot. And I had just come from my shiur in the yeshiva where I was studying for smicha with a rabbi by the name of Leib Baron. And Rabbi Baron was explaining to us that according to the Midrash, when it rains on Erev Sukkot, God is telling us that he is unhappy with his people because he is rejecting our offering to sit in the sukkah to fulfill the mitzvah of Leishev Basukah, which is only biblically mandated on that first evening. And if it rains, one cannot fulfill the mitzvah. And so the Midrash compares it to a woman who prepares for her husband a beautiful pot of soup, and he dumps it over her head. It's a rather harsh comparison. In any event, I had left the yeshiva with that very unhappy thought in mind on Erev Sukkot, and I went to the kosher bakery to cheer myself up with some chocolates and get some challahs. And who do I see? Levi Becker, and who was friendly with my father and who I knew, casually really. And I was a college student at the time, and he said, "Allan, you seem a little down or depressed or whatever it was." And I told him what I learned from Rabbi Baron, that Hashem... Let me explain. I actually believed what Rabbi Baron had told me. Literally. That was where I was then. Okay? And I was a little, it was a downer. This was not the Kaplan idea of Sukkot as fighting against human happiness. And so I told him the Maisa, the Midrash, with which he was familiar. And he said to me, "Allan, let me help you out." And he took out I still remember this, a small index card, and he wrote something down, and he handed it to me. And he said, "Go get this." And as I was walking away, he said, "Oh, Allan, one thing. The rain today is not a miracle." And what he wrote on the card was... Judaism without supernaturalism, Kaplan. I had never read a word that Kaplan had written. And that was my first exposure to Mordechai Kaplan on a day of inclement weather. Now let me get to the substance of what I want to say about Kaplan and Spinoza. I was going to talk about the God idea, and I actually typed out a lecture about the God idea in Kaplan versus the God idea in Spinoza. I think it's a very fine lecture. You're not going to hear it. It's pure theology, and I make a distinction between Spinoza's forbiddingly determined and bound God, bound by the laws of his own nature, which defines his freedom. Very difficult concept to wrap one's mind around. Versus Kaplan's much more dynamic, there's a process involved in the Kaplanian development of the God idea. There's no process in Spinoza's God. There can't be any process. The fixed laws of nature absolutely bind Spinoza's God. And so human emotions cannot in any way benefit from integrating an idea of God and allowing it to guide them or to give them light or reason to do things. There's nothing inspirational about Spinoza's God. That was the argument of the paper that I'm not going to give. I changed my mind because of something Manny Goldsmith said. A fabulous story. Manny Goldsmith gets up and he tells this incredible story that one day at the seminary he was walking around. And he sees Kaplan sitting. Am I getting this right? Kaplan was sitting by himself. What? At SAJ. Thank you. Right, I knew it. Thank you. He's at SAJ and he sees Kaplan sitting and crying. And he says to him, Professor Kaplan, why are you crying? Although I'm betting that he said, for was weinst du? Why are you crying? And he said, because of the Jewish people, what's going to be with the Jewish people? What's going to be? Was wird sein mit der jüdischen Volk, right? What's going to be with the Jewish people? And I thought to myself, is there any scenario, even in the most radical so-called transcendental interpretations of Spinoza that have become popular and thankfully are now falling out of popularity, is it conceivable to imagine Spinoza sitting and crying about the future of the Jewish people? The only thing I could see Spinoza crying about vis-a-vis Jews is their continued existence. And so it seemed to me that perhaps a more powerful subject among the many that one might benefit from considering in the limited time I have is not the question of the immanent God, supernaturalism versus naturalism, human authorship of the Torah, rejection of, the rejection of any idea of theodicy, a divine purpose in the world, God sending the snow for a reason. These are all areas in which Kaplan and Spinoza happen to be in agreement. There are many areas in which they happen to be in agreement. That doesn't mean that Kaplan was, in any profound sense, influenced by Spinoza or would have considered himself a Spinozist. But the most powerful, I think, common doctrine to Spinoza and Kaplan that at the same time they share, and yet the different places they go with it so radically distinguish one from the other is their common rejection of the doctrine of Ata b'chartanu mikol ha'amim, the doctrine of the election of Israel. Spinoza famously and vehemently and actually very nastily rejected the doctrine of the election of the Jews in the 3rd chapter of the Theological and Political Treatise. It is a frighteningly anti-Semitic piece of writing. And I use that word advisedly. I'm not the first. I rely on the late Arthur Hertzberg, Zichrono Livracha. Ironically, it's also the chapter in which Spinoza very cynically says, well, maybe if the Jews' religion haven't emasculated them too much, they may be chosen again by God and reconstitute their state. And all the Jews, like Klausner and Ben-Gurion, jumped up and down and said, oh, Spinoza was a Zionist. Narishkeit. Kaplan, of course, famously rejected the notion of the chosenness of Israel or the election of Israel. But the way in which they respectively phrased their rejections, their shared rejection of this doctrine of the divine election of the Jewish people, is perhaps the most powerful proof of how very different Kaplan and Spinoza were in their attitude towards not just the Jewish people, but the meaning of their respective lives and their places in the world. So let me just begin with let me begin with Spinoza. Spinoza in the TTP, the Theological Political Treatise, chapter 3, says the following. I'll just sum it up very quickly. But it's a chapter very, very worth reading, probably one of the most important single chapters in all of Spinoza's writing in assessing Spinoza's attitude towards the Jews and towards Judaism, but especially towards the Jews. It's called On the Vocation of the Jews, right? Do the Jews have a vocation? And he begins the chapter by saying, look, the very notion, the very sentiment that one would delight and boast in having been blessed with something that someone else doesn't have reeks of immaturity, selfishness, mean-spiritedness, childishness, and evil, or badness in Elwis's translation. In other words, he's saying that the Jews, because the Jews feel this way, they are all of those things. They have all of those attributes. Then he goes on to demolish the idea using scriptural and philosophical arguments. And then comes what I think is the most interesting part of the chapter, where he suddenly turns and says, I much prefer the doctrine, as he puts it, of Paul. And he comes to Romans chapter 3. And he offers an interpretation of Romans chapter 3, where Paul rhetorically asks of what advantage the Jews. 55 seconds? That's a joke, right? That reminds me of a joke that Mel Skult once told me. No. Okay, yeah. So Spinoza, that's right. I'll leave Kaplan B for the moment, because those of you, and most of you are familiar with what Kaplan has said about chosenness and what he replaced it with, which was a vocation, right? That the Jews had a special vocation. Put that down. You're gonna. That looks better. Can you do that one more time? So it's Romans chapter 3. Now, in Romans chapter 3, Paul very famously asks rhetorically of what advantage have the Jews and what advantage does circumcision offer? And then he answers very strangely. Oh, well, of everything, because it is, after all, the blessing of God that is upon them. Now, in the history of Pauline scholarship, there's a long history of debates among New Testament scholars as to what Paul meant in Romans chapter 3. There are basically three possibilities. There's a range of possibilities, but there's the classical sort of mild interpretation, which was that Paul was addressing his audience. He was an apostle to the Gentiles, not to the Jews, and he was trying to assuage the potential for resentment and hatred towards the Jews because of their notion that they are chosen, have an advantage, and only they are circumcised. Then he turns to the Greeks and says, but you do not need that covenant or that circumcision. You live by faith, which is repeated much more forcefully in Galatians chapter 3, very, very, very powerfully. That's one possible interpretation. The other interpretation is that Paul was being deliberately ambiguous. And the third and nastiest interpretation, and the one that was resurrected by the Reformation, by Luther, and by many other German Protestant churches, is really the anti-Semitic interpretation of Romans chapter 3. Not just that verse, but the entire chapter, and the deliberate focus on chapter 3 instead of chapters 9 through 11, in which Paul is famously much more kind and generous towards the Jews, their covenant, and towards circumcision. Spinoza chooses the absolutely most vicious possible interpretation of Romans 3, and he focuses only on Romans 3, ignoring, and I have no doubt that he knew the rest of the book, he knew all of Paul's letters very well. And Spinoza writes, and so he concludes, towards the end of the TTP chapter 3, he says, and so Paul's doctrine is exactly mine. Paul's doctrine, as he interprets it, is exactly mine. In other words, the Jews have not only no advantage over other people, but their covenant is a covenant of sin. This is all, we don't have to, do I have time to get into an exegesis of Romans 3? No. Okay, but read it. It's a covenant of sin. In other words, the law is only for sinners, right? Those who are free of sin have no need for law. Hence, the Jews are the sinners, and the circumcision is the sign not of their covenant, but the sign of their sinfulness. And Spinoza takes that, he endorses it, and he makes it his own. And then he goes on to conclude his chapter, and with this I'll conclude. I will just quote. Okay. At the present time, therefore, this is Spinoza, I'm quoting directly. At the present time, therefore, there is absolutely not a thing which the Jews can arrogate to themselves beyond other people. Quite the contrary. As for their continuance so long after dispersion and the loss of their empire, about which they boast as miraculous, we've all heard that, right, from some rabbi, there is nothing marvelous in it at all. For the Jews have so separated themselves from any other nation, from every other nation, as to have drawn down upon themselves and earned universal hatred, not only by their outward rights conflicting with those of civilized nations, but especially by the sign of circumcision, which they so stubbornly and scrupulously observe. And then he goes on to talk about circumcision, and then he says, the sign of circumcision is so powerful that I might persuade myself that it alone may preserve this nation forever. And he's saying this with a certain degree of, more than a certain degree, with contempt. I find this to be absolutely hateful, contemptuous. What Spinoza is doing here is, in case it wasn't clear enough, among many other things, is he is adopting as his own the most anti-Jewish possible interpretation of Pauline theology. And then, as if that weren't enough, he goes on to blame the Jews for the hatred that others harbor towards them. They have so separated themselves, and circumcision. In other words, the reason people hate the Jews is because we're circumcised. It's a doubtful proposition. And we have weird customs, and we separate ourselves from other people. This is really, this is hateful stuff. I don't think Kaplan was unaware of this. And as I said, yes, one can easily list shared doctrines, one of which is the rejection of the idea of chosenness. But my, oh my, how different Spinoza's angry and vicious rejection of the doctrine of Am Segula and Kaplan's revaluation of it, if you'll forgive me somewhat misusing that term, revaluation it and rebuilding it into something, into an alternative notion of a unique mission, a mission which he, by the way, since we're in Washington, in a wonderful line in The Future of the American Jews, he compares the Jews to the President of the United States. You know, the line where he says, one wouldn't want to hear the President of the United States get up every morning and say, thank God I'm not the janitor at the Five and Dime. You know that line, right? right? So too, we Jews shouldn't talk that way. We shouldn't say "Ata b'chartanu mikol amim, asher b'chabranu mikol amim," because that would be like the President of the United States. There's no doubt the President of the United States has a bigger job, as do we Jews have a bigger job. That is something Spinoza would never say. And finally, once again, I'm trying to conjure up the image. Maybe someone with an imagination like Quentin Tarantino can do it. An image of Spinoza sitting and sobbing because he is so dejected about the suffering of his Jewish people. Thank you.
So even now, well over 60 years after his premature death, Milton Steinberg's relationship to his teacher, Mordechai Kaplan, remains the subject of much interest and controversy. So it's a pleasure to welcome Rabbi Dr. Elliot Cosgrove to talk about Kaplan and Steinberg.
Yeah, there's one right. You guys, there's one there. It's one sheet of paper. Someone left a watch here. I'll sell it to the highest. Okay. In a commencement speech to the 2005 graduating class of Kenyon College, the late David Foster Wallace began his remarks with the following parable. Two young fish were swimming along and happened upon an older fish swimming in the opposite direction. The older fish nodded at them, saying, "Mornin', boys, how's the water?" The two young fish swam on for a bit, and then, breaking the silence, one of them eventually looked at the other and said, "What the hell is water?" The point of the fish story for Wallace and for us today is that it's inevitably the case that the most obvious and most important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. And today it's that kind of reality to which we turn, God. In the context of today's panel, how Milton Steinberg felt about Mordechai Kaplan's conception of God. To be clear, my goals are not to examine Steinberg's theology, nor Kaplan's for that matter, but the more curious topic of what God meant in the context of the relationship between Kaplan and his student, colleague, and friend, one of my predecessors at Park Avenue Synagogue, Milton Steinberg. I'm grateful to my fellow presenters and the organizers of this conference, especially Dan Cederbaum and Dr. Mel Skult, not only for the opportunity to present, for their passion, menschlichkeit, and mentorship, but as you will see, alerting me to an intriguing point of entry into the subject matter. As you'll momentarily find, their counsels, Dr. Skultz and Cederbaum, proved to not only be productive and clarifying, but an unforeseen opportunity to reconsider the theological relationship between Steinberg and his beloved teacher. By way of background, both Kaplan and Steinberg readily acknowledged the depth of their relationship. In his work on Steinberg, the late Simon Novick explains that it was Kaplan, only Kaplan, that kept Steinberg at JTS. Kaplan would readily acknowledge Steinberg as one of his most brilliant students. In examining the Steinberg papers, I found ample evidence of their intellectual and professional relationship, collaborating on the movement, writing a prayer book, matters of the mind and of the heart. Today's tale begins quietly enough with a book review penned by Ira Eisenstein in the October 1960 issue of The Reconstructionist. Steinberg died in 1950 at the age of 47, as Dan said, and 10 years later, his devoted student, the late Arthur A. Cohen, edited and compiled a selection of Steinberg's theological writings, previously published articles, essays, and in some cases, addresses that had been hitherto unpublished. Entitled Anatomy of Faith, the volume is perhaps the best introduction to Steinberg's thought, and at least for me, a reminder of the might-have-beens had Steinberg lived to enjoy the blessings of years. By all signs, he was on the verge of articulating a systematic theological stance of his own. Cohen, a product of Park Avenue Synagogue, would develop his own post-Holocaust theological voice in his own right. He viewed Steinberg as his intellectual and spiritual mentor. Indeed, as told by my teacher, Paul Mendes Floor, in his edited collection of Cohen's writings, it was Steinberg's pastoral and theological intervention and influence on the young Arthur Cohen that not only prompted Cohen's own spiritual journey, but prevented Cohen from leaving the faith altogether. Eisenstein's review of Cohen's volume on Steinberg is critical not of Steinberg, but of Cohen. Aside from a series of objections regarding Cohen's biographical characterization of Steinberg, specifically Steinberg's relationship with Kaplan, with whom, of course, Eisenstein had his own independent relationships, Eisenstein takes issue with matters of editorial license. Literally months prior to Steinberg's March 1950 passing, he delivered a series of lectures at Park Avenue, several of which speak to Steinberg's assessment of Kaplan's theology. Steinberg finds fault in Cohen's volume in Kaplan, and you have the printed version on a handout. Kaplan does not decide, nor is, this is the language, quoting it, Kaplan does not decide, nor is it necessary from his own point of view, that he decide whether God is an entity, a being, an aspect of reality, or a useful fiction. In a subsequent paragraph, Steinberg makes explicit the point of his theological difference, stating, "It is precisely in Kaplan's dispatch of the metaphysical problem that I have always had my most grievous difficulties with his thought. It makes a great deal of difference to me whether God is an entity, a being in himself, an aspect of reality, or a useful fiction." All right, that's all for that. Sensing something amiss, Eisenstein asks a question outright. Quoting Eisenstein now, "I cannot imagine that Milton would have ever thought that for Kaplan, God was a useful fiction. I do not understand how this phrase could have crept into the text at all." Citing the years the three men, Kaplan, Eisenstein, and Steinberg, collaborated together, the depth of their relationship, Eisenstein further protests, "I fail to understand how it could have ever occurred to Milton, if it did occur to him, that Kaplan thought of God merely as a convenient device. Whether anything came of the review following its publication, I have no idea. Anatomy of Faith, as noted, continues to stand as the best window into Steinberg's thought, embedded within it a notable theological break between student and teacher. And this was the case until a few months ago, when Mel Skult told me to go down to the Steinberg papers. Because in researching the Steinberg papers, I found the stenograph copy of Steinberg's lecture, not what Cohen said he said, but what he actually said, and the two are not the same. According to the transcript, which is on the other side of your paper, first, quoting Steinberg in his own words, "Kaplan will not make up his mind, he doesn't have to, he says, on whether God is an entity, a being, or an aspect of reality. And then, here is one of the points I have never been able to follow. To me, it makes a great deal of difference whether God is an entity, a being in himself, or whether he is an aspect of reality." As a preacher and as a writer, I'm well aware of the difference between the spoken word and written prose, and in many respects, I'm sympathetic to Cohen's daunting editorial task of giving his teacher's spoken words written expression, a comma here, a redundancy there, maybe even a word choice or occasional clarification. In this instance, however, Cohen has overreached both in tone and, more importantly, in content. What for Steinberg was a point in need of clarification, in Cohen's words, became a grievous difficulty. This sin, however, pales in comparison to Cohen attributing to Steinberg a characterization of Kaplan's theology that Steinberg never actually expressed. Steinberg never used the word useful fiction to describe Kaplan's God, but Cohen said he did. Steinberg knew the term useful fiction. It appears in Basic Judaism and elsewhere, a philosophic concept introduced by Weihinger in his philosophy as if concept. The hero in all of this, of course, is Eisenstein, who knew enough to suspect that Steinberg had been mischaracterized, a suspicion now confirmed here today, decades later. All of which leaves us with two questions, one minor and one major, and in the short time we have left. First, what would have prompted Cohen to mischaracterize his teacher Steinberg as he did? And second, more substantively, what did Steinberg really think of Kaplan's God? Now is not the time to enter into an appreciation or critique of Arthur Cohen's theological contributions or personal profile. Telling for our purposes, however, is the title of his primary volume of theology, The Natural and Supernatural Jew. Though admitting the natural and supernatural Jew to be joined in every Jew, it is for Cohen the vocation of the supernatural for which the Jew exists and endures. Cohen's assessment of Steinberg is so warm it borders on devotional, and his estimation of Kaplan so critical as to verge on the ad hominem. Consider this passage from his treatment of Kaplan. This is Cohen's words. It is precisely the genius of the Jew that he is unnatural, not that he is maladjusted, but that he is unadjusted, not that he is reconstructed, but that he is unreconstructed. There are no guarantees, Cohen goes on, that the modes of adjustment which Kaplan has defined, the system of double sancta, the definition of American religion to underwrite the normality of Jewish, he goes on, I don't need to read the whole thing, will do more than hasten the destruction of the Jewish people. With the record corrected, it strikes me as less than productive and charitable to conjecture as to the motivations behind Cohen's editorial license. Perhaps it's best simply to leave it that the edits reveal more about what Cohen thought of Kaplan theologically and perhaps personally than whatever Steinberg ever said about his teacher. So what did Steinberg actually say about Kaplan's God? If he didn't believe that Kaplan believed God to be a useful fiction, then what did he believe Kaplan believed? Privately, as Novick relates, there were significant and critical differences. Steinberg confided in Jacob Cohn in a private correspondence, I'll quote it, maybe not all of it, it is one of Kaplan's limitations that he has almost no metaphysical interest, this is Steinberg, perhaps no metaphysical sensitivity. To him, Kaplan, God is a concept, at least so he always speaks of God rather than an existential reality, the reality of realities. Or to put it otherwise, to Kaplan, God represents the psychological and sociological consequences of the God idea rather than the cosmic din as and sich, the thing unto itself. It is for its sociology of Jewish life that I am a reconstructionist, Steinberg writes, not for the clarity or the utility of Kaplan's theology. I've often challenged Kaplan on that point. His response is that metaphysics is personal religion as opposed to tradition-sanctioned group expression. I've never been able to see the value of the validity of the distinction he makes. The above letter makes it more than clear that Steinberg did indeed hold reservations about Kaplan's God, reservations he shared publicly at the 1949 Rabbinical Assembly Convention, which was actually read by Judah Golden due to Steinberg's ailing health. For Steinberg, Kaplan's perceived lack of metaphysics was, given his theological leanings, raising more questions than it resolved. In Steinberg's own words, Kaplan's God idea resulted in some of the following questions. Number one, the actuality of God is brought under question. It is asked, does God really exist, or is he only man's notion? Is there anything objective which corresponds to the subjective conception? And who adds up the sum in the sum total of forces that makes for salvation? Is a sum added out there, or is it in the human imagination? B, the universe is left unexplained. To say of God that he is a power within the scheme of things leaves a scheme altogether unaccounted for. Steinberg lists other considerations, including that in Kaplan's stance, a need arises for another God in addition to Kaplan's, and that in such a stance something, quote, alarmingly close to tribalism in religion is revived. He is gracious through and through, writing, quote, the case for religion without metaphysical theology could not conceivably be presented with greater piety, skill, and integrity than by Kaplan. It is a good as case as far as it goes. It does not go far enough. Steinberg reiterated his position in what would be the paper published a month prior to his passing. In reference to Kaplan, he writes, quote, the riddle of the universe is not so readily to be dismissed, and faith is not only a psychological and ethical venture, but a cognitive one, also an affirmation concerning the ultimate nature of things. As for Kaplan, in Steinberg's passing, he would downplay the dissent from his student. referring to it as a, quote, molehill out of which anti-Reconstructionists have made such a mountain. Kaplan's argument tellingly is not that he and Steinberg were in agreement, merely that Kaplan's main concern is not to define God, but to provide an account of the pragmatic function of the belief in the God idea. The Reconstructionist movement could house a plurality of conceptions of God, even a theistically minded one such as Steinberg's. In Kaplan's telling, no break existed between him and Steinberg, and those claiming one did so only to, quote, rob Reconstructionism of the prestige for having Steinberg's name associated with it. Kaplan may indeed have been correct in his suspicions, the example of Cohen's editorial license being one such example, no different than a feud regarding a physical estate. Following Steinberg's passing, competing claims quickly emerged regarding his theological estate. Nevertheless, it is the opinion of this author that in this case Kaplan protested a bit too much. Steinberg's God was transcendent, absolute, and imbued with consciousness and will in a way Kaplan's God was not. In all my reading, Dr. Scult, maybe you found this, I've yet to find where, if ever, Steinberg stated that Kaplan's God was not God enough. But there was clearly a difference. Steinberg knew it, and I imagine that Kaplan knew it as well. It's a curious adventure to research the estimation of a student for his teacher, and I thank this conference for giving me the opportunity to do so. As I said, the question is not what Steinberg thought of Kaplan's God, neither to examine Kaplan's theology nor Steinberg's, but what Steinberg thought of Kaplan, a modern day how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And yet as a congregational rabbi, I would contend that it's precisely this narrow space, or better yet, the give and take between the two that most of North American Jewry still exists. Long gone are the days that Jews, Reform, Conservative, or even Orthodox subscribe to a pre-modern or fundamentalist view of God. Steinberg did not believe in talking snakes, splitting seas, and a long-bearded God, but he pushed back on Kaplan's God idea, insistent on the power and reasonableness of belief in a transcendent God. The debate between Kaplan and Steinberg matters deeply because it covers territory that in many respects remains resonant and relevant today. Ultimately, the most important thing Kaplan and Steinberg shared was not their views, and not even, for that matter, their friendship. On this count, I believe Dr. Scult is correct in claiming that the most important thing they shared was a questing spirit, what Heschel refers to as radical amazement, a poetic, if not romantic, appreciation for the enigma of existence, the depth of the human soul, and the humble acknowledgement that there will always be far more about this world that we do not know than we do. Both men thirsted for God. Both men sought to articulate answers of spiritual and intellectual integrity and intensity, and both men worked tirelessly on behalf of the Jewish people. Did they disagree? Of course they did. But they swam together, side by side, seeking to understand, express, and respond to the most important mysteries of our lives. Thank you.
Where's my pen?
Hey, we don't have all day, man.
You watch it. Thank you, Elliot. That was great. So we now move from Kaplan and individuals to Kaplan and broader ideas, and actually the segue comes naturally. We welcome Dr. Michael Fagenblat to talk about Kaplan and theology more broadly.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Dan, for your amazing work for this great conference. And thank you very much also for the opportunity that it's given me to get more familiar with Mordechai Kaplan's work, which I've enjoyed doing very much, and I'm sure is only the beginning of my acquaintance with him. I want to begin with a beautiful citation that I found in The Religion of Ethical Nationhood and then I'll launch into it. My paper is called Kaplan and the Project of Naturalizing Jewish Theology. The quote goes like this: "To believe in God, we have to exercise wisdom. To believe in man, we have to exercise faith." I want to elaborate on the first half of that for the most part, and then conclude with something about the second half of it again. I'll just read it quickly again. To believe in God, we have to exercise wisdom. To believe in man, we have to exercise faith. I'm interested in the contribution that Kaplan's work makes to an impasse that I perceive in modern Jewish thought. And in order to see how Kaplan might contribute to this impasse, I think we have to, in a certain sense, read Kaplan against himself, read the theologian against the sociologist. Kaplan refers to God in many ways, and they're not always elaborated, at least not sufficiently, and sometimes they seem to be a little bit ambiguous, or perhaps even stand in contradiction to each other. And my intention is then to think with Kaplan about why and how to naturalize Jewish theology, or if you like, in a certain sense, to reconstruct Kaplan's natural Jewish theology. The impasse that I perceive in modern Jewish thought generally has to do with the widespread rejection of metaphysics that we've seen in the last 50 or even 100 years in philosophical culture. And there's a certain irony that's happened with this rejection of metaphysics, because at the same time as there's been a type of refusal of metaphysics until quite recent years in a whole range of diverse philosophical movements: pragmatism, phenomenology, scientism, linguistic turn, positivism, deconstruction, hermeneutics, historicism, all these movements which have very little in common except for the rejection of metaphysics. We've also seen simultaneously this so-called return to religion, or a so-called desecularization of the world. And there's a certain way in which these two trajectories have supported each other. Modern anti-metaphysics has contributed, in fact, to the return to religion in an ironic way, by indefinitely suspending theological claims regarding God's real existence and true nature. The intellectual legitimacy of religion in the secular age, and in Jewish modernity in particular, is based on a type of Faustian deal. Enjoy as much religion as you like, so long as you give up on theology. And this is where I think Kaplan comes into the picture. Maybe I'll just read another sentence by a contemporary French thinker who's been critical of this movement, Quentin Meillassoux. I've got a long quote, but I'll just cite a sentence. He says, "Faith is pitched against faith, since what determines our fundamental choices cannot be rationally proved. And the result of this is a generalized becoming religious of thought, that is, a fideism of any belief whatsoever." So we have this sort of open supermarket of beliefs, as long as we don't actually lay claim to anything absolute. And in one sense, Kaplan's sociological approach to Judaism and his great debt to Durkheim is a case in point. It risks entertaining the prospect of a Judaism without metaphysics, without theological truth. Judaism is an ever-changing, inexhaustibly flexible civilization that can be reconstructed without end. The absence of metaphysical reality justifies the adoption of whatever theological beliefs suit the historical hour. And it's not surprising that the fallen crown of God is picked up by ideologues who are prepared to stand in the metaphysical breach and to install the community of Israel, the people of Israel, or even the state of Israel into the very void of heaven. This leads me to suggest that the importance of Kaplan today consists not in his reduction of Judaism to sociology, but on the contrary, in his emboldening us to transcend the self-adoration of peoplehood, whereby too many Jews worship their own image in the place where the truths of God can no longer be seen. A quote from Kaplan: "Israel would indeed prove to be God's chosen people were it to function as God's servant, but by its own admission, Israel is far from having actually served God." Okay, now comes the sort of meat and potatoes of my paper: naturalizing theology, vitalism or phenomenology, or not reducing to what? That's the question I want to ask. What are we not reducing to? Kaplan points to an indispensable theological direction, though not the only one, for overcoming the impasse brought about by the idolatrous reduction of Jewish faith to peoplehood. As is well known, Kaplan's contribution involved the naturalization of Jewish theology. This naturalization emerged from Kaplan's commitment to maintaining consistency between theological belief and all else that we hold to be true. modern life adopts, explicitly and even more so implicitly, beliefs in scientifically discovered or discoverable laws which range over the entirety of our experience and identifies the basic items, constituents to which those laws, over which those laws range, the physical elements, atoms, charge, spin, and all that sort of stuff. Contemporary philosophers unpack this scientific worldview in two ways. They talk of the causal closure or the causal completeness of the world, which is to say that either there are no non-physical causes to physical events, or in a weaker version, that there is no explanatory value in positing non-physical causes for physical events. And they also talk of a methodological naturalism, according to which it is rational to be guided in metaphysics by the methods of natural science and its abundant naturalistic yield. Kaplan, I think, in his own way, accepted both these premises. He thought that the modern world, he thought that the world was causally closed in the sense that no non-physical cause needs to be assumed in order to explain every physical event. And he also accepted the methodological naturalism. But here I think we have to be careful. No doubt Kaplan thought we should be guided in metaphysics and theology by the methods of natural science, and we should restrict ourselves to theologically affirming the yields of scientific rigour. Nevertheless, Kaplan was not a reductionist. He thought that natural science was consistent with, quote, the intuition that life inherently yields ethical and spiritual values, that it is holy. On the one hand, then, we have a rejection of supernatural causality. On the other hand, we have a rejection of scientific reductionism that would see ethical and spiritual values as nothing but illusions or epiphenomenal effects of atoms colliding in the void. Kaplan clearly belongs in the broad tent of what is today called non-reductive naturalism. But what exactly is not reduced in non-reductive naturalism? I take this to be the crucial question that needs to be addressed. It's here that I find some of Kaplan's formulations at times wanting and at other times entirely plausible. In the philosophical literature, the main contenders for non-reductive natural events are mental states or states of consciousness, which many regard as irreducible to physical brain states. The irreducibility of the mental to the physical, of mind to brain, is advanced for several reasons, such as the intentional structure of consciousness, the phenomenal qualities of mental states, the feelings of pain or seeing, of redness, the externality of mental content, and other hard problems to do with consciousness. Often enough, Kaplan seems to have adopted some such view of consciousness as the natural but irreducible correlate, as he calls it, of the natural realm. I want to suggest that that's a bit of a dead end. Even if consciousness were a final and unique frontier of transcendence, of non-reductionism, this would only justify a type of humanism, not a theology. Self-realization and self-fulfillment are sometimes not the worst sins, it's true. But when taken as the very purpose of theology, they reiterate the cardinal sin of anthropomorphism by worshipping an image of oneself rather than of God's self. But Kaplan offers another way of understanding non-reductive naturalism, which I find even more interesting. I glean this from an important point made by Mel Scult regarding Kaplan's view of the contingent nature of the self. He quotes from a fascinating 1943 diary entry by Kaplan, quote, "Intellectually, I cannot posit the existence of the self, for the little I know of psychology tells me that the self is an illusion. The self is no more an identifiable being," says Kaplan, "than is God." The implication I draw from this is that Kaplan's non-reductive naturalism does not rest on consciousness or on the self, for we just saw that he is in fact prepared to reduce the self to some ongoing natural process. What then is not reduced in Kaplan's non-reductive naturalism? If the answer is not consciousness, then what is it? Obviously, the final answer is going to be God. Kaplan repeatedly denied he was an atheist. But it's more difficult to specify the sense and the way by which God is irreducible to nature. Mel Scult convincingly suggests that Kaplan's non-reductionism reiterates Bergson's view of life as a vital impulse, élan vital, in the world. If this is what Kaplan has in mind in speaking of a power or force, it too is not particularly helpful, as Scult likewise suggests. As was the case with the vitalist debates at the turn of the 20th century, the problem here is that this power seems to be some non-physical causal force over and above the physical causes for which we can account. It would be a power that is somehow both natural and unobservable. So I doubt that the metaphysics of a vital power is the best way to naturalize Jewish theology, any theology. Let's try again then. If God is not the spirit of self-realization or self-consciousness, nor a power or force over and above those in the natural realm, what is not reduced in theological naturalism? The answer I favour, which I think Kaplan at times also endorses, is that certain forms of meaning are irreducible natural features of reality. These manifest forms of natural meaning, this bottle of water, this table, your faces as presented to me, are meaningful, not because of something extra the conscious life imposes on them, some extra meaning or representation. They are manifest forms of meaning, not by virtue of the mind or consciousness, and not even by virtue of culture or civilization. It is not because of consciousness or brain-related processes, nor because of cultural processes, nor, of course, because of some nor because of some vital impulse or power, that things appear to us in certain forms and as bearing certain qualities. The relation goes the other way round. Because things appear in certain forms with intrinsic qualities, as they do appear to us, that's why they appear to us at all. The naturalism I'm promoting is phenomenological, of the thing itself as it appears, not a chaotic empirical mass which one chooses to bestow meaning upon or to render meaningful in one way or another. This is a type of process, as Kaplan, of course, emphasized, but the process takes the form of meanings that present or give themselves and does not leave it to some other power, a creative power that we could call God, or a subjective power that we could call self, to render meaning out of these processes. Natural processes give natural forms of meaning, like water, or digital screens, or again, faces. Emphasizing process without form has the undesirable effect of making us search for some extra power in God or in ourselves that makes these processes into meanings. But before we have even started to look, like the fish in water, meaning has already made so many natural forms manifest. This is an ordinary mysticism of everyday natural experience, for every form given is, in a certain sense, one face or one aspect of God. Here then is the reconstruction of Kaplan's naturalism that I suggest, noting my substantial debt to the analytic philosopher Mark Johnston from Princeton University, whose book, Saving God, Religion After Idolatry, might interest anyone who takes this religion without supernaturalism seriously. That which is not reduced in theological naturalism are the forms of meaning manifest in nature. There is no self or power or spirit or consciousness at work, only the outpouring of forms of meaning manifest in nature. God is not something over and above these outpourings of manifest meaning. God is just the totality of those outpourings, a totality which, it is important to emphasize, goes well beyond our capacity to experience the forms of meaning. These forms of meaning include affects, such as pain, or perceptions, such as the contents of visual experience, and that's important because it can help us make sense of the idea that God might suffer wherever there is pain, or be seen where things give themselves to be seen. Hence, especially, but not only, in the natural realm and in art. A simple analogy, which I borrow from Johnson, can be helpful. From the proposition that water is wholly constituted by H2O, some may think that water is identical to, and therefore reducible to H2O. If I say to Allan, I'm thirsty, would you pass me the water? I could just say, I'm thirsty, Allan, please pass me the H2O. We'll get to brachas later. And yet, though water is indeed wholly constituted by H2O, it's not reducible to H2O, because H2O can come in other forms than water, like steam or snow or ice, each of which is different, and yet none of which is less natural or less real than water. When you say pass me the water, you don't mean pass me the H2O, you mean pass me the manifest form of H2O that has the natural qualities of being liquid, quenching, and so forth. Water then is wholly constituted by H2O, but not reducible to H2O. water is wholly natural, but the meaning of water is not reducible or identical to its natural constituents, the H2O atoms. Crucially, nor is the meaning of water simply projected onto those atoms by human beings or by representations of the brain, and nor is some power, neither supernatural nor some élan vital, a natural power, producing this form of H2O. It's rather that H2O comes in, appears as manifest natural forms that are not reducible to the basic physical elements of which it can be variously constituted. That's what I mean by speaking of the non-reducible forms of meaning manifest in nature. We can now venture the first step of an answer. How is it that God is not reduced to nature in Kaplan's non-reductive naturalistic theology? The answer is that Kaplan thinks of God as wholly constituted by natural processes, but not reducible to them, nor identical with them, much like the relationship of water to H2O, since God manifests not as the elemental particles of the natural realm, but as manifest, manifold, natural forms. The God idea refers to the outpouring of these forms of meaning or manifold, irreducible senses that the natural constituents of the universe manifest. Kaplan sometimes spoke about this in terms of the sum or totality of natural processes. There is nothing subjective about this, nor can it be confused with scientific reductionism. It's perhaps for this reason that Kaplan could speak of an experience of God and of knowledge of God, for one needs to know the various forms of nature to understand them, not just their elemental constituents. One needs to taste and see that the Lord is good, just like the more one knows how to drink, swim, ski, sail, freeze, one knows H2O. Many of the manifest aspects of God can be accessed only by active embodied creatures, and some aspects of God, that is, some manifestations of the natural forms of meaning, are not able to be accessed by human beings at all, given our particular limited natures. There are colours, for example, that we can't see, although birds can. They are, as it were, in the mind of God, whereas we only sample of this reality. Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek la'olam haba. Is that before the 5 or after? Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek la'olam haba. All Israel has a part in the world to come. If the world to come is the totality of all manifestations or processes of reality, which is to say that it is the world as seen by God, as human creatures, we can attain a part, a chelek, in that world. And this is exactly, in fact, how Ralbag Gersonides, the great medieval Jewish philosopher, understands that classical dictum, all Israel has a part in the world to come. That is my attempt to naturalize theology in a Kaplanian spirit. It can be called panentheism, which differs from pantheism in that it views God not as identical with nature and therefore reducible to the sciences of nature, but as wholly constituted by nature without being identical with it. But this does not mean that there is some vital extra force or some additional contribution of consciousness that makes for it. It means that the appearing of forms of meaning are themselves irreducible. They are the natural metaphysical realities in which we live. And God is the sum, as Kaplan says, of all these transnatural forms of meaning, which are really out there, as real as water, trees, or the faces of the person next to you. One quick last section. Can I have a couple more minutes? Go ahead. From the exercise of wisdom to the exercise of faith, or towards the naturalization of revelation. We need to take one more step, at least. For one can always ask, what makes those manifest forms of meaning in any way godly? They could just as well be atheistic, non-reductive forms. After all, a tsunami or a snowstorm is another form of H2O. Is that also an aspect of God? In one sense, the answer is yes. And seeing a tsunami or a snowstorm indeed yields more knowledge of the manifest forms of H2O and thereby more knowledge of some aspect, which is a word of Kaplan's, of the awesome power of God or of the beauty of holiness, as we saw before. And yet when a tsunami or even a snowstorm destroys the lives of hundreds and thousands of people, it's no longer an aspect of the cosmos that makes for man's salvation, as Kaplan understood God, but one that makes for human destruction. Perhaps it is the naturalization of the Sitra Achra, the other side of God. I suspect the Kaplan would rather suggest that the point of emphasizing salvation or ultimate concern, the term he took from Tillich, is precisely to distinguish between those natural forms of God conducive to human flourishing and those that are not. Cancers and plagues and rapists are also natural forms that appear. What makes them less godly than a bush of roses or Art Nouveau doorknobs? I cannot answer this question in detail at this stage. But Kaplan's answer goes like this. We select, quote, we select out of the infinite processes in the universe that complex of forces and relationships which makes for the highest fulfillment of man as a human being and identify it by the term God. Here we see how right and yet not quite Kaplan was. Or perhaps I'm just not American enough to go all the way with MMK. For God is not the product of our selecting. God is not the product of our selecting, but a reality that gives itself as it is. And self-realization, while perhaps a byproduct of God's self-giving, is not the purpose of it. This is what another philosopher, another Jewish philosopher, Emanuel Levinas, seeks to explain in his account of Jewish faith. Drawing on the mythic and revelatory rather than the naturalistic elements of Jewish theology, but in no way violating the naturalistic constraints mentioned above, Levinas shows how the exercise of a certain faith as emunah, as a fidelity to the uniqueness of the other, generates the moral convictions we have concerning the plurality of manifest forms of human life. What Levinas calls the face is precisely the manifestation of the normative form of a person, the normative form. Kaplan agrees, and he must have something like this in mind when he says, quote, God denotes the power or process that makes for normative man. The wisdom which, properly exercised in a naturalistic fashion, enables us to believe in God, cannot be founded without exercising faith in each other. Levinas shows how we might exercise this faith. Together, they can bring to fruition the sentence of Kaplan's, to believe in God, we have to exercise wisdom. To believe in man, we have to exercise faith. Thank you.
Dr. Elliot Ratzman, who was to deliver a paper on Kaplan and Mussar, sends his regrets. The weather kept him in Philadelphia, but we will check with him. If he has a written presentation that he'd like to share, we'll certainly include it with the conference materials and make sure it's readily available on our website. So that brings us to the fascinating topic of Kaplan and Orthodoxy, from which he sprang. So it's a pleasure to introduce Mr. Daniel Ross Goodman.
Thank you. The book of Exodus, chapter 23, verse 7 states, Midvar sheker tirchach, distance yourself from falsehood. The Torah commands Jews not only not to lie, but to keep far away from falsehood. If one would keep track of the number of times that Mordecai Kaplan is mentioned by contemporary Orthodox Jews, one would think that my community, the Orthodox community, observes an additional commandment: keep far away from Kaplan. Among contemporary Orthodox Jews who seek to maintain doctrinal purity, in a world in which Orthodox scholars have demonstrated the fallacy of the notion of Jewish doctrinal purity, Mordecai Kaplan is verboten. He is the one whose name shall not be mentioned. And when Orthodox Jews do incorporate practices or notions whose origins lie in Kaplan's writings, such as Jewish community centers, the conception of Judaism as a civilization, or the bat mitzvah, such ideas are almost never attributed to their original source. I would like to suggest that the name and the thought of Mordecai Kaplan is not a subject that we in the Orthodox community have to distance ourselves from. For not only is Kaplan's thought relevant for the present and future of our community, in fact, Kaplan's thought has already become integrated into the thought of contemporary Orthodox leaders and thinkers. First, I will offer some examples that illustrate what it means to say that much of contemporary liberal Orthodox rhetoric bespeaks an assimilation of the rhetoric of Kaplan. Then I will attempt to offer an interpretation of this phenomenon, a phenomenon I term the orthodoxization of non-orthodox thought. This term should not connote a positive or negative value judgment. It is a term I've selected to explicate a component of a larger intellectual phenomenon that can be construed as the reconstruction of Orthodox Judaism. There are some philosophical and many methodological and linguistic similarities between Kaplan and contemporary liberal Orthodox thinkers, but I wish to focus on one commonality of emphasis I have found time and time again between the liberal Orthodox thought of today and the thought of Mordecai Kaplan, and that is their joint emphasis upon the Jewish teaching that each human being possesses supreme dignity. If one reads the writings of pre-20th century Orthodox thinkers, one does not necessarily find this overriding emphasis on the dignity of the human being. Yes, there's a passage in the Talmud which posits that the most important principle in the Torah is the teaching that every human being is created in the image of God. But two other verses, one being love your neighbor as yourself, are also considered as candidates for the greatest principle in the Torah. Yet, in the latter half of the 20th century, Rabbi Irving Greenberg has insisted that the principle that each human being is in the image of God is the core teaching of Judaism. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs argued in his book, The Dignity of Difference, that, quote, perhaps the most influential single phrase in Western civilization is the verse in the first chapter of Genesis, in which God says, "Let us make man in our image and likeness." What was said was not that a human being can be in the image of God, but that every human being is in the image of God. Similarly, the late liberal Orthodox thinker Rabbi Dr. David Hartman, in A Living Covenant, writes, "An ethical vision of life places human dignity, human autonomy, and the intrinsic significance of human life at the center of the universe." And here again is Rabbi Sachs in The Great Partnership. The discovery of human dignity is perhaps the single most important idea given to the world by Abrahamic monotheism. That faith was the first to teach that every human being, regardless of color, culture, or creed, is in the image and likeness of God. The first to teach the sanctity of human life and the dignity of the human person. And in Radical Then, Radical Now, he writes, of all the great religions, Judaism has the strongest conception of freedom and dignity of the individual, beginning with the principle that the human person as such is the one bearer of the image of God. Why in the 20th century, and particularly in the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, Tselem Elohim, or Imago Dei, the doctrine that every human being is created in the image of God has become so emphasized, and why it is being interpreted in certain ways is a complex intellectual history question, and my research is currently devoted in part to explicating what I believe are the literary influences that have become embedded into the modern Judaic interpretations of this teaching. But for the purposes of this presentation, what is noteworthy is that before my teacher, Rabbi Greenberg, and Rabbi Sachs elevated Imago Dei to the top of the hierarchy of Jewish values, Mordecai Kaplan did so in his magnum opus, Judaism as a Civilization. Kaplan was explicit in his contention that the teaching of the human being in the image of God should be accorded maximal importance. He writes, quote, "The traditional values of Judaism should be drawn upon to show to what extent the sanctity of the human person has implicitly played a part in shaping some of the most important laws and practices of the Jewish people." Unquote. And here, perhaps Rabbi Sachs's most important contribution to Jewish thought, the idea in The Dignity of Difference that has garnered him such unfair condemnation from certain segments of Orthodoxy, is that, quote, Judaism was able to conceive of a universal God, but not yet of a universal faith. Judaism is a particularist monotheism. It believes in one God, but not in one religion, one culture, one truth. The God of Abraham is the God of all mankind, but the faith of Abraham is not the faith of all mankind. And later on the same page, he continues, biblical monotheism is not the idea that there is one God and therefore one truth, one faith, one way of life. And later, page 55, there is a difference between God and religion. God is universal, religions are particular. God is God of all humanity, but no single faith is or should be the faith of all humanity. And again, in Radical Then, Radical Now, page 96, Judaism argues that there is one God and many faiths. Here's Rabbi Greenberg in For the Sake of Heaven and Earth. Quote, Jews must recognize the full implications of the truth that God has many messengers, unquote. And here's the prolepsis of the notion of God as universal and religion as particular. Quote, the hope that there will arise a religion which will be universally acceptable is chimerical. Religion must be many to satisfy man's needs. The mutual tolerance of religions can come about only through the recognition that each religion must strive to have its beliefs and practices meet the universal needs of human nature, and that each religion must cultivate the uniqueness which arises from the particular civilization constituting its background, unquote. Mordecai Kaplan, Judaism as a Civilization, pages 330 and 331. And we could go on. Rabbi Sachs's notion that before Judaism, pagan civilizations believed in cyclical time, that Judaism introduced to the world the concept of linear time, and that, quote, the journey of the Jewish people through time constitutes a story, unquote, is prefigured in Judaism as a Civilization, page 261. Quote, history, not in the sense of a chronology of events, but as a drama of national life, in which there are plot and meaning, was unknown before the historical books of the Bible made their appearance, unquote. And Rabbi Sachs's articulation of Judaism as a religion that is fundamentally forward-looking, or, as the title of his book on this subject says, how Judaism is in the future tense, is also foreshadowed in Kaplan's evocation of Judaism as a consciousness that is, quote, always employed in the contemplation of the future, unquote. And one more, Kaplan wrote, quote, the failure to make Jewish learning relevant to living issues has been inherited by modern rabbinical institutions whose curricula are based on the method and spirit of the German Jewish scholars of the 19th century, unquote. Later, Rabbi Sachs wrote, quote, we do not live in the 19th century, yet contemporary Jewish thought seems locked in 19th century terms, unquote. Now, how can all of these similarities in language and content be explained? Professor Shai Cohen has written of a phenomenon he has termed the rabbinization of non-rabbinic materials. The early rabbis, Dr. Cohen writes, assimilated the works of Josephus and other historical sources into rabbinic writings, and the early rabbis then reshaped these sources and transformed them to serve the rabbinic ideological agenda. It is my belief that a similar orthodoxization of non-orthodox thought has occurred. Progressive Orthodox rabbinic thought leaders appear to have transformed or orthodoxized non-orthodox thought in ways that allow ideas that were originally non-orthodox to serve the orthodox ideological, halachic, and intellectual agenda of contemporary progressive Orthodox Judaism. This phenomenon is not inauthentic or unkosher as far as orthodoxy should be concerned. Rabbinization or orthodoxization of non-normative sources has been a recurring phenomenon in Jewish life. Early Judaism absorbed the concepts of life after death and resurrection from Zoroastrianism and the eternality of the soul from Neoplatonism. Maimonides absorbed philosophical concepts from Aristotle and Al-Farabi. Rav Soloveitchik absorbed philosophical concepts from Kant, Hegel, and Kierkegaard. These non-rabbinic concepts were rabbinized, and now Kaplan's non-orthodox thought is being orthodoxized. Even if it cannot be ascertained whether the early rabbis consciously integrated Zoroastrian and Neoplatonic thought into rabbinic thought, and even if it cannot be determined whether contemporary Orthodox rabbis have consciously assimilated Kaplan's thought into their own writings, The application of several schools of literary theory and interpretation to this phenomenon would suggest that concepts, language, and phraseology from non-Orthodox writers have become unconsciously integrated and assimilated into the writing of Orthodox thinkers. Russian literary theorist Emin Bakhtin coined a term for this unconscious or occasionally conscious assimilation of the words, phrases, and ideas of others into one's own writing, heteroglossia. Intellectual cross-cultural pollination is a recurring literary phenomenon, most evident in the ways in which, for example, Shakespeare's phraseology has been incorporated into the English lexicon to such an extent that he need not even be referenced in order to discern phrases that bear his influence. And it is a recurring phenomenon, I believe, in theological literature as well. The strong Jewish theological precursors of the previous generation, Mordecai Kaplan and Abraham Joshua Heschel, have so profoundly influenced Jewish spiritual intellectual thinking and writing in a similar way in which Shakespeare and Milton have influenced English literature, culture, and language, that Heschelian and Kaplanian concepts and phrases need not even be explicitly referenced in order to be aware of the sources of some of these phrases. For example, Heschel's conception of the Sabbath as a day in which Jews build palaces in time, not in space, has become so pervasive that it is strewn in various forms across contemporary Orthodox writing about the Sabbath. Like Shakespeare's idea of the world as a stage, this conception of the Sabbath has been absorbed into our own thinking and lexicon and has become part of our modern Jewish vocabulary. Bakhtin, in Discourse in the Novel, writes, quote, "The ideological coming to consciousness of a human in this view is the process of selectively assimilating the words of others," unquote. A close reading of the thought of current Orthodox thinkers reveals that the thought of Kaplan is assimilated into their own work. Language, Bakhtin writes, for the individual consciousness lies on the borderline between oneself and the other. The word in language is half someone else's. It becomes one's own only when the speaker populates it with his own intentions, his own accent, when he appropriates the word, adapting it to his own semantic and expressive intention. Prior to this moment of appropriation, the word does not exist in a neutral and impersonal language. It is not, after all, out of a dictionary that a speaker gets his words, but rather it exists in other people's mouths, in other people's contexts, serving other people's intentions. It is from there that one must take the word and make it his own. Unbeknownst to them or not, Orthodox leaders have assimilated the thought of Kaplan into an Orthodox semantic and expressive form and have made Kaplan's thought serve our own Orthodox intentions. To paraphrase Derrida, the Orthodox community has mastered how to speak in Kaplan's language without renouncing our own Orthodox language. The past is what we know, but we're not aware of knowing it, said T.S. Eliot. Rabbi Sachs's writings hearken to the past model of Kaplan's writings, but we may not be aware of knowing Kaplan precisely because of how strong Kaplan's influence has been. We can think we're seeing something new. We can think we're creating something new, but sometimes we're really riffing on the past without really knowing it. It's especially hard to escape the influence of strong originalists like Kaplan and his entirely new mode of translating Judaism into a modern idiom. Nevertheless, originality does inhere in a work that is consciously or unconsciously riffing on a predecessor's work, much as we would still think of Picasso's Le Ménine, Vue d'ensemble d'après Velázquez as an original work, even though, or precisely because, it is an homage to Velázquez's Las Meninas. The Satan of Paradise Lost no more generated himself than we have generated Kaplan's ideas on our own. But, just as it was crucial for the Miltonic Satan to have believed in his own self-creation, it is crucial for our community to maintain a belief in our own self-generation of these concepts. To conclude, if an orthodoxization of non-orthodox thought can be called a veritable modern intellectual phenomenon, what does this say about the originality of contemporary Orthodox thought? I will attempt an original knight's move that is really not so original. I will allow Stefan Mallarmé's conception of originality to shed light upon this phenomenon. In 1927, Mallarmé wrote, "We say that an author is original when we cannot trace the hidden transformations that others underwent in his mind. We mean to say that the dependence of what he does on what others have done is excessively complex and irregular. There are works in the likeness of others and works that are the reverse of others. But there are also works of which the relation with earlier productions is so intricate that we become confused and attribute them to the direct intervention of the gods." And in Analects, Mallarmé wrote, "Nothing is more original, nothing more oneself than to feed on others, but one has to digest them. A lion is made of assimilated sheep." And finally, Mallarmé, also in Analects, wrote, "The hallmark of the greatest art is that imitations of it are legitimate, worthwhile, tolerable, that it is not demolished or devoured by them, or they by it. If developing the work of others is not merely derivative, but is constitutive of originality, the orthodoxization of non-orthodox thought is a profoundly original intellectual phenomenon." Thank you very much.
Yishar Kuchachem, that was wonderful. Questions? I've got one right here, a couple. Okay. For Mr. Goodman. Can you imagine more of Kaplan's ideas in particular, entering into orthodoxy, at least of the type you experience at Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, and what specifically and how might that happen?
Wow. This is hard to say. That's right. There is a contingent of my school and my colleagues and my friends at APAC, so perhaps that's one aspect of his thought. Another one that I have thought about is the thesis, the idea that Judaism is meant to serve the Jewish people. Sometimes we can get caught up in a notion of avodat Hashem in which we need to sublimate ourselves, subjugate ourselves, and nullify ourselves. And there is that stream in our tradition that says, batel retzoncha mipnei retzono, to nullify your will. But on the other hand, what you have when you have this all-encompassing notion of avodat Hashem is that your own will, which is important, which is crucially important, can get lost. Putting your own spin, your own accent on your avodat Hashem, your divine service. So I think viewing Judaism as something in which we're not only commanded to serve God, but as a religion, as a way of life that can actually serve Jews and enhance our own lives is something that I'd like to see incorporated.
Great. For Dr. Fagenblat, isn't the place of will central for clarifying why we choose to understand only certain phenomena in the world as divine? I'm just reading.
Yeah. Well, historically, I think that's certainly the case. I think that's until, that's what it's been. That's the sort of essence of the personal God is this idea of a will at work in nature and history and so forth. I think that I'm inclined to say, I think Kaplan would clearly say that we don't have any reason to believe in a will at work in the world. And I'm inclined to agree with Kaplan and further to agree that this is in fact an opening to a type of purified form of faith, which isn't about... The thing about a will at work in the world is it's about what I can get from... what I need and what I can get, and and how it can satisfy me in some way, and in many ways which are completely understandable. People are dependent and they're sick and they have all sorts of things that they can't, that they need. But I think that if God is the highest object of devotion, then it goes beyond the level of need, and we can afford, in some sense, to think beyond the level of will.
Okay. One for Rabbi Dr. Nadler. So if we grant that Spinoza was not a nice Jewish boy, and Kaplan maybe was on many levels, what do you think of the characterization? I actually think, this is me, I heard from your colleague Ken Seeskin once that Kaplan can be seen, at least in part, as trying to drag Spinoza, kicking and screaming, back into the fold of the Jewish people.
There were many, very many, especially in the late 1920s through to the outbreak of the Second World War. 1927 was a banner year because it was the 250th anniversary, Yortzeit, 1677? Yeah, that's right, 1927. The Yortzeit of Spinoza, and Jewish organizations and synagogues, temples, Reform, some conservative temples, Jewish centers all over North America, Europe, Warsaw, Tel Aviv, New York, Montreal, everywhere. We're having celebrations inducting Spinoza, forgiving him and inducting him. And the most famous of those celebrations, which has been repeated many, many times, and I noticed that in Mel Skult's new book, he mentions it too, was Yosef Klausner on Mount Scopus, who formally rescinded the cherem and said, Achinu ata, hutar ha-cherem, sar avon hayadut me'alecha, and so on and so forth. You're forgiven and you're welcome. So this is the idea of bringing Spinoza screaming and yelling back into the Jewish fold. This was happening all over the place. In fact, when Eric first proposed the subject to me, I went to my my closet, not where I hide my sexual identity, but where I hide my insanity, and it contains 17 boxes, archival boxes of files about the attempt to Judaize Spinoza, including 11 boxes of files of Yiddish literature about Spinoza, Yiddish translations of Spinoza, and there's Hebrew materials, German material, French material, English material. In all told, I've counted 183 Jewish writers who wrote about Spinoza, all in that spirit. Kaplan was not one of them because he never wrote a single systematic essay about Spinoza. That's why I was a little, initially, you remember, Eric, hesitant. I said, there isn't really much there. I mean, he's not even in my...
We've heard he gave Spinoza to his students regularly.
Okay, so yes, Spinoza's on the syllabus. That's different than publishing a book or an essay about Spinoza. I'm not saying he was disinterested in Spinoza. No question that there were, as I said in my talk, affinities. But I don't think Kaplan was a leading figure in, he wasn't part of that gang on the Lower East Side that founded the International Spinoza Society Yiddischer Upteil, the Yiddish division, where they were giving courses in the ethics in Yiddish. I mean, there were active Yiddish and Hebraic Spinozas. Daniel Schwartz, who teaches here at GWU, published a book about the Hebrew, I think the book's called The First Modern Jew, and it's all about that. This is a very large subject. It killed me when I saw that book because I'd been doing research towards the book but never wrote a word for 23 years. But anyway, that happens. But the one thing I'll say is that, and so yes, can we include Kaplan in that gang? Yeah, as a kind of onlooker, as a mild Spinozist. And certainly not as a central player. He was no Melech Ravitch or Shatsky or Ben Gurion. The list goes on and on and on of enthusiastic, serious Spinozists, ideological Spinozists, which, as I think maybe too passionately contend, Kaplan could not be called a Spinozist. However, the only correction I would make to Professor Seeskin's remark is a matter of nuance. I think Spinoza was so indifferent to the Jews and the Jewish people that he wouldn't even bother kick and scream. He would just lie back and let nature take its course. You know, so that's. But thank you for the question.
Okay, very last question we have to end. This is for Rabbi Dr. Cosgrove. Will Park Avenue Synagogue consider paying its back dues to the Reconstructionist movement? You don't have to answer. So with that, we're going to take a 10-minute break, unless you want to answer.
They can't afford to. They pay their clergy so much.
But I'll give you a good story, if you want a story, which is why is Park Avenue Synagogue the quote-unquote flagship conservative synagogue, or what it is?
I know what their website says.
Right, but it's a Reform synagogue. It's a classically Reform synagogue. And if you go there, you see both the direction of the synagogue, the organ, everything there. But when Rabbi Steinberg's predecessor was no longer rabbi, they sent the head of the search committee out and said, take the bus to the seminary and find us a new rabbi. At the time, I think it might have been Fifth Avenue, went both ways. Instead of going down to HUC, he took the bus the wrong way and went up to the seminary with Finkelstein, understood what was going on, but before he did, he said, let me just send you my guy, just as an interview, who was then in Indianapolis. Steinberg had just was writing As a Driven Leaf, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Great.
So.
Thank you.